Thank you for joining us for this webinar hosted by the Middle East Policy Council. Today, we will explore how the US-Israeli war on Iran is reshaping the Gulf. I am very pleased to be joined by a panel of leading experts on the region. We have Gregory Gauss, Associate Fellow at the Middle East Institute and Professor Emeritus of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Services at Texas A&M University. We are also joined by Christine Diwan, Senior Resident Scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute. And from Kuwait, we have Hamad Nayan, Assistant Professor of International Relations in the Department of Political Science at Kuwait University. Thank you all for being here. Let me open with a question framed by two developments that took place today. On one hand, the GCC convened a summit in Riyadh to address the ongoing war. And the other, the UAE announced its exit from OPEC. One development suggests some kind of an attempt to build a unified position, while the other points to a potential of fragmentation in terms of reactions to the war. Since the outbreak of the war on February 28, there has been an ongoing debate whether to what extent does this conflict foster greater unity among Gulf states, and to what extent does it deepen existing divisions? I would like to hear each of your perspectives on this. So start with you, Greg.
Well, if you had asked me yesterday, I would have said that the war has probably brought the Gulf states closer together and ameliorated some of the differences. But with the announcement of the UAE leaving OPEC that was made today, it does seem to me that the war might have exacerbated the differences that the Emiratis felt, because I think this is a quite dramatic step. I mean, OPEC has always been a group that acknowledged Saudi Arabia's leading role. And if you were a member of OPEC, you basically were acknowledging that Saudi Arabia had the lead in terms of how coordination would occur among oil producers. And leaving OPEC, particularly now, in this period of high tension and uncertainty surrounding this war, is, I think, a very clear signal that the Emiratis are moving away from the acceptance of Saudi leadership on a range of issues. You're muted.
Yeah. So, Kristen, what do you think?
Well, I wrote a piece, I think, the first week of the war, talking about how it looked like the rift. That, of course, we need to remember that Saudi Arabia and the UAE entered this war with a serious rift. I wrote that it looked like there were efforts to mend that rift. In fact, I think one of the first actions that Mohammed bin Salman did was to call up Mohammed bin Zayed, and I think it was the first time they had spoken. So I did write this piece the first week in the war. I wrote another piece, I think it came out a couple of weeks ago, saying that this is finished, that the mending is finished. And there's been clear signs of tension pretty close to near the start of the war, actually reenacting between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. I think what we see is a continuation of strategies that had started before the war, and a deepening of that, where when they're faced with this huge challenge, which, let's not sugarcoat it, it's an enormous challenge that Iran is posing now. They have always posed a challenge, but now that they're much more willing to directly attack the Gulf states, and are now holding the Strait of Hormuz, a much larger challenge, that when faced with that, we've clearly seen a fracturing of the positions of the Gulf states, how they're going to deal with this Iranian challenge. And I think it goes along with the strategies that they had been pursuing prior to the war towards what they see as a deepening regionalization of their security, when they can't rely completely upon the United States and they have to effectively look at the powers around them and how they're going to deal with them. And I think we see clearly Oman, which you didn't mention, but it looks like Oman may not have even attended the GCC meeting today, moving a bit closer towards Iran, or at least this kind of positive neutrality, which means to be positive in the direction of Iran neutrality. We see the UAE leaning much more heavily on their partnership with Israel, which they've even announced that they got significant defense support from Israel in this war. And we see Saudi leaning more on its Arab and Islamic base. So I think there's a clear division in strategies amongst the different Gulf states, and I expect that will continue.
Thank you. Hamad?
Thank you, Sultan. And it's a pleasure to be on this panel with friends and experts on the region. I think that the UAE decision was not a sudden emotional decision. Rumors of possible UAE exit have circulated since at least 2020, 2021. They've always felt that OPEC Plus restricted their spare production capacity. They have argued that their baseline quota was unfairly low. So basically, that decision is accelerating UAE's own energy transition, and they want maximum control of over how and when it monetizes its oil resources. It does not destroy Gulf security cooperation like we've seen in air defenses, intelligence sharing, which the war actually strengthened over the past 2 months. But it underscores that unity remains selective and fragile. Let me first say that it's still too early to make judgments, as the war is still unfolding and the region is still absorbing the shock and trying to understand its implications. On 28th of February, the Gulf states found themselves in a war they neither supported nor prepared for. The US started a war without consulting them, and the Iranian regime retaliated against them, even though they have publicly stated over and over again that they will not allow the US to carry offensive actions from the bases they host. For the first time in history, all 6 Gulf states, all 6 of them, were collectively under direct major Iranian assault. They endured waves of ballistic missiles and drones that hit not only US bases, but power plants, water desalination facilities, oil infrastructure, even civilian building and civilian casualties were not spared. This is a type of warfare that the Gulf states were not prepared for. But even despite that, they have successfully intercepted more than 90% of more than 6,000 Iranian projectiles, despite the high cost, between the Iranian drones and the Gulf air defenses. So they interpret the escalation as a fundamental breach where Iran shifted from indirect proxy harassment to more direct calibrated attacks on their sovereign territories. When we talk about the Gulf states, we always ask this question, are they united or not? We forget the fact that we are referring to 6 countries, 6 governments, 6 separate and overlapping interests. So in terms of unity, the Iranian attacks did spark a rally around the flank of the Gulf states. Diplomatically, they condemned the Iranian aggression. They pushed for the UN Security Council Resolution 2817. They coordinated air defenses. They shared intelligence at a higher pace, much faster than they ever did before. They all publicly called for de-escalation. They supported the ceasefire talks pending the results. They all demanded the unconditional reopening of Strait of Hormuz for safe passage. And even when we talk about Saudi Arabia and UAE, previously at odds over Yemen, Sudan, and they have their own economic competition going on, they showed greater alignment in condemning Iran. No Gulf state is interested to see Iran coming out of this war more emboldened regionally or to normalize the strong threat against them. But the Gulf states' approach to these aims varied. We saw the UAE and Bahrain being the more hawkish, Oman, Qatar on the other end being more dovish, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia falling somewhere in the middle. But the lack of a unified GCC military response is probably due to multiple factors. There's a concern that the US might abruptly end the war, and these states will end up facing the security and economic consequences of the confrontation. Also, most of the Gulf states view Israel's expansionist agenda as another concern. They don't want to be viewed as part of a military coalition with Israel. But the fact is that the Gulf states will unlikely conduct such military response without Saudi participation and support. And Riyadh did not want to go this route due to the reasons, stated previously, as well as Iran's ability to match the kingdom's tolerance by not threatening its Red Sea oil shipments via Bab el-Mandeb. The question moving forward that the Gulf states will have to live with is how their decision to refrain from responding militarily and overtly to the Iranian aggression will inform the Iranian behavior in the future. They have demonstrated commendable self-restraint, yes, but Tehran could also understand it as a lack of will in the Gulf to engage offensively, and this will also have consequences. So the war did encourage greater unity to a moderate extent, but by forcing practical cooperation between them, not only military, but even economical, through the supply routes. And it did not fundamentally increase divisions beyond what already existed pre-war.
Interesting point, Hamad. Thank you. So I want to build on this discussion, and I want to ask. So it seems from the answers that all of you gave that it seems that what happened before the war still shapes the positions and the policies that they are taking in terms of oil, in terms of inter-rivalry between countries, etc. So to what degree can we say about this war is causing a paradigm shift in terms of how these countries are shaping their policies, shaping their ways of looking to each other and coordinate with each other? Or are we saying that the change will be in degree but not in kind, that then the differences and divides that we've seen and the cooperation that we've seen in the past and have been manifested itself during the war will continue as they are, but they will differ in terms of magnitude, but not in necessarily in terms of kind? What do you think, Greg?
So after the Gulf War of 1990-91, there was a lot of talk about how that would change the nature of the relations among the Gulf states. And in fact, it didn't. And so I think Hamid's point that that these states are 6 different states, and they have tended to come together at times of crisis, but have all had different approaches and different interests remains true. And in fact, the fact that the UAE announced this departure from OPEC while this war is still going on, basically, I think indicates that the amount of time during crisis that they will come together is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And so it's I mean, my thought on this is that if this coordinated attack by Iran on all 6 states, far beyond what anyone anticipated, can't bring the 6 together in terms of a common, at least a common defense policy, then you'd have to say that basically no crisis is going to fundamentally change the fact that these are 6 sovereign states which are going to pursue their own interests and not be willing to sacrifice elements of sovereignty in order to better coordinate policy going forward. If on one end of international organizations, we think of the EU, where states have given up substantial elements of sovereignty, right, in order to cooperate better for what they think will be the common good. And on the complete other end of international organizations, something as loose as the UN, right, which really imposes very few obligations on its members, and certainly no giving up of sovereignty. The GCC always kind of saw itself, or at least its proponents saw it as more toward the EU side of that continuum. But I think this demonstrates it's going to be more toward, if you will, the UN or God help us, the Arab League model of very few, very little willingness to give up any element of sovereignty in order to try to increase the efficiency of a united response on any front.
Before I go to Kristen, I want to follow up with you, Greg. So don't you think that the Iranian retaliation itself has not been distributed evenly among the Gulf countries? So some countries were hit less, and some other countries were hit more, and that might contribute into each one of these countries learning different lesson from the situation.
I'm not sure that I'd agree with that, because to some extent, yes. I mean, why the Iranians hit the UAE more than they hit Saudi? Why Kuwait was hit more than Oman? Who can figure out Iranian targeting policies, right? I mean, I think that this could be a demonstration of a lack of coordination or kind of independent decision-making centers within the Iranian military. Figuring out Iranian strategy here it remains a puzzle to me. I think that each of the 6 GCC members received such a significant element of Iranian attacks that it would be hard for any one of them to conclude, oh, the Iranians went easy on us. No, they didn't go easy on anybody. And the severity of their concentration on some rather than others seems to me to be something that's a question that will be very hard to answer going forward. But I think that answer is probably more in command and control issues within Iran. So if I'm sitting in one of the countries that was on the lower end of the Iranian attacks, I'm not saying, wow, our strategy worked. The Iranians didn't hit us that much. I think everybody's got to rethink their strategy toward it.
Thank you. So, Kristen, going back to my question, so do you see more of continuity from pre-war policies, or that the war would cause some kind of significant change in terms of kind?
Yeah, I could kind of lean into your suggestion there. I mean, I think even from my initial comments, I said that I see a lot of the same patterns that I saw leading into the war. If we look at strategy towards Israel, for instance, in the border peace and the Palestinians, you have attempts, really strong attempts, I think, by the states to sort of unify their policies. But with UAE having much more specific interests and willing to take a leadership and willing to lean into its already sort of ties with Israel to allow it to take a more leadership position, where we saw Saudi Arabia saying, we're not willing to go that far. We're going to lean into our relations with Arab and Islamic states and see if we can bridge them with Europe to pull a different incentive for Israel. So I think like those patterns that I was talking about in terms of the way that they're trying to leverage their foreign partners and alignments was already present. I think the big question for me is like, is this crisis serious enough that it makes a bit more of a breaking point? Like, okay, so we already know that Oman was willing to be more of a mediator, that they expressed kind of more sympathy for the Iranian position, or at least able to voice the Iranian concerns more concretely. But if they're actually going to, and I'm not saying they are, but let's say, Iran's been leaning into that, like, oh, we can make a deal with Oman as our partner across from the Strait of Hormuz, and maybe we'll make something that's workable with them. If they're doing that at the same time, UAE is saying, we don't want to have anything to do with Iran, and we're leaning into taking a much more hawkish position, that's going to be harder to coordinate, over that issue. That may not be it. And I think Hammond's point that the war isn't over yet, and we don't know how things are going to end up and how all of them may adapt according to how Iranian power looks at the end of all of this. I think that's true. But I just think it makes it a bit tougher for some of these policies to just be sort of papered over when the consequences are so high. I will say for the GCC, though, GCC is a pretty easy club. It's like the requirements aren't like too heavy. they try to make it more lenient, like when the UAE and Saudi were leaning really heavy into their special relationship and tried to do a lot more direct, like we're going to work on our unity, not overall GCC unity. They adjusted the rules like, okay, that's fine. As long as you guys can go and do those bilateral things, which they weren't supposed to be able to do, as long as it's helping overall Gulf unity, they adjust the rules. So I think the GCC will be kind of very flexible. And I think their overall interest as fellow Gulf monarchies is going to have other things for both not just their external interest, but also their internal interest that will mean that it still makes a lot of sense for them to cooperate. So I think the GCC could actually survive this. But again, its meaning, as always, will kind of shift depending on how this comes out.
Thank you. Hamad, continuity or break?
I second Greg's point. If the discussion in the Gulf moves toward who gets beaten less by Iran and why we should continue doing this, then it's game over. Remember, Sultan, that the Gulf states, all of them were attacked, regardless of the states being mediator or not, which I'm referring to Oman and Qatar. Regardless if you have relationship with Israel or not, UAE and Bahrain. Kuwait and Saudi Arabia did not normalize relation with Israel. So they have selected all with no differentiation. And if we allow this discussion to cut in the Gulf security and to put a division based on who gets beaten less, then Iran will continue doing what it has been doing and attacking the Gulf states, and that will have a major impact on the Gulf. I think the Iranian aggression overall will permanently reorient the GCC policy toward aggressive dual-track deterrence. I'm talking militarily and economically against the Islamic Republic and its proxies in the region. And the attacks, keep in mind, Sultan, they were not aimed at US bases, but it struck the heart of energy and critical infrastructure of the Gulf. It didn't matter if you had a US base or not. And the attacks were not directed against the US bases. And even all of the 6 Gulf states did not have US bases. Iran will continue, will redo what has done over the past 2 months, and they will attack the Gulf states. It's important to keep this in perspective, and I think the Gulf states understand it. And Oman many people could view Oman that it's leaning toward Iran. I think, as Kristen was saying, positive neutrality in terms of trying to balance its relation. Oman views Iran as a threat, but it chooses to deal with Iran in a different way. And that role is welcomed and tolerated in the GCC because they understand the importance of these back channels between them and the Iranian leadership through Oman.
Thank you, Hamad. So let's move to another aspect of the war and its impact on the Gulf, and I want to ask each one of you, what do you think are the short-term and long-term consequences of the war? We've seen the war has exposed some vulnerability in terms of the reliance on the Strait of Hormuz and the ability of some of Gulf countries to help in terms of providing logistical support to the others. We've seen some military capabilities in terms of high interception rate, but at the same time, the imbalance in terms of the cost of intercepting cheap drones and missiles. How do we think of this war in terms of impacting certain aspects of GCC countries, both in the short term and the long term? I would start with you, Kristen.
There's so many different things we could pick at. I think it's worth underlining that their overall strategy is really a bit in shambles right now. And I mean, it's not really through any fault of their own. It's just this situation that they find themselves in with the United States and Israel pursuing their own interests and Iran retaliating according to their own interests, all in ways that don't really take into consideration Gulf interests. And I don't think any sort of drawing closer to the United States or any sort of further mediation they would have done with Iran would have necessarily saved them. I think this is a consequence of increasing Israeli and Iranian competition over the region that, you know, the United States also has its hands on that. So it's really difficult. I mean, I think to figure out, and I think that's why it's hard to have agreement on what kind of their tactics and strategy should be in this really difficult situation. The one thing today's news of the Emiratis leaving OPEC concerns me, though, is that we know that part of the consequence of the war is going to be a more challenging economic environment for them. And of course, this was the priority of all of these states going into this war, to the degree that they had all chosen détente, which they had with Iran. It was because they really wanted to focus on their own economic growth and sort of protecting that arena that the Gulf states had of security, they thought, to you know, push further global integration. I mean, the Emiratis taking this move right now, which is something I agree with Hamad that they've talked about for a long time, but doing it now is leaning in much more on that issue of competition, because this will benefit the UAE, but it's going to hurt Saudi Arabia. I mean, I think the Saudis are much more susceptible to drops in oil prices, which, you know, I know the Emiratis are just saying we're still going to be responsible in the market. Yes, but the whole reason for stepping out of OPEC is that it gives them more flexibility to kind of act to see in their own interests. So that tells me that they're looking at this post-war environment, that plus they're kind of planning whatever they're doing with the United States about currency swaps. They're really looking critically at, like, okay, this is going to be a good challenge, you know, and they're concerned with how they're going to be situated economically coming out of this. And I think that's going to send another message of further competition, which is what we had before the war. So, you know, I think we could talk about many ways of coordination that would benefit all of them. And I think Hammond's right in that. But just the signs I'm seeing are not very positive that those are the pathways that they're choosing.
I want to follow up, Christine, on this. So we've seen since the war started a debate and discussion about that this war would lead to an end of the Gulf model, the Dubai model, and this kind of a form of development and a form of situating Gulf cities in the global market as a hub and a safe haven for people to come and in terms of taxes, in terms of tourism, in terms of investment, etc., etc., etc. So how do you see the impact of the war on such claims?
Well, I think that's a bit overblown. I mean, talking about the end of the Gulf model. I mean, these states have been building, if you look at a country, well, not a country, an emirate like Dubai, building this model of based on their logistics, based on being this kind of global hub. I mean, it has really deep roots now. And a lot of countries have bought into it. A lot of individuals have bought into it. And there's a logic for it. I mean, it makes a lot of sense that these countries geographically where they sit, that they can take advantage of that geography. But there is no question that this is going to be a challenge to it. And I think it's really hard to know how big that consequence is going to be until we sort of know how the war ends. Because if it ends in a way that it's very indecisive and there's kind of continual, I don't know, they talk about the Israeli mowing the lawn or going back against Iran, and Iran always has an incentive to attack the Gulf states. It's going to be hard for them to regain any of that sort of stability. And I do think it is something that I think a lot of us have been wondering, is like, it's been sort of incredible to see the collapse of security across the whole region. And Greg, I know you've written about this a lot, and how the Gulf states have managed to sort of preserve their isolation from all of the different, well, not isolation, but, you know, they've been able to preserve their growth model and state security at the same time that we've seen, you know, what's happening in Yemen and what's happening in Syria before that, and now what's happening in Palestine, and, you know, the list goes on. I think it is another reminder that it's very hard to completely escape all of that. And I think the Gulf states were aware of that. I mean, they have been trying to play a role in those issues, but it underlines it a little more. So I don't know this model of sort of focusing very much on their own, how that's going to sort of work with all of these other things still unresolved.
Thank you, Hamad. So going back to my question about long short-term impact on Gulf countries.
Well, what happened over the past 60 days in terms of the Iranian escalation, all of this leads to one conclusion, that Iran viewed its neighbors as a collateral damage in this war to raise the cost of it, and the Gulf states will undoubtedly act accordingly. I think militarily, the bloc is rapidly building integrated air and missile defenses, expanding joint commands. There is significant emphasis on localization of the military industry. They are actively seeking capable and willing international partners to help them in this aim. They are pushing for a better radar integration, early warning, and counter drone capabilities to address the saturation tactics. They have also initiated discussions to procure air defenses from several key partners. There is an effort to acquire cost-effective Ukrainian-made drone interceptors to protect key facilities, and it's interesting to see that cooperation with Ukraine in this aspect. But the Gulf states have learned a hard lesson in the past 2 months, that they are facing this new warfare where integrated air defenses alone is not enough and cannot be the only solution. So I'm expecting that they will want to deter Iran by acquiring similar drones to balance the threat. And we can talk about this later. I think the economic aspect of it, of the consequences, what happened shows that they took a direct hit with combined losses estimated between 103 and 168 billion US dollars. Saudi Arabia and UAE, yes, they managed to mitigate the losses through the oil pipelines and the supply routes to other Gulf states. Oil and gas companies in Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, they all declared force majeure to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the attacks on its installations. The biggest blow economically is Iran threatening the Strait of Hormuz, and by that they are holding the world's economy hostage, and now they are illegally demanding or trying to lobby for a toll system for future transit. So if the international community allows such a blackmailing model to exist, then it will only expand to every strait and waterway where countries will have to negotiate for every ship, which ultimately will dismantle the economic order as we know today. I don't think that the Gulf states will allow Iran such outcome. They will try to fight it as much as possible at any cost. Presumably, controlling oil passage through Strait of Hormuz means dictating oil prices. This ultimately will weaken the Saudi traditional role as a swing producer in the oil market. I expect that the Gulf states will incrementally reduce its dependency on the Strait of Hormuz as a risk diversification tool by looking into expanding sea and land supply, oil and supply routes via Oman, and even potentially from Syria as well. And, the argument goes that, pipelines could be targeted by drones, yes, but they can also be easily fixed, like we've seen in the East-West pipeline and Saudi Arabia that was able to be fixed within days. So an unintended consequence of this war could be increased economic GCC integration. It goes back to the point that we were discussing, that there is selective unity between the Gulf states. I think that will be one of them. The Gulf states will accelerate their own economic diversification away from Iranian influence while strengthening their own and collective to deter any future Iranian aggression. And it's important to mention the two, their own and their collective, because I think the states will work. These states will work on both of these aspects.
Thank you, Hamad. Greg.
So on the short term, the thing that surprised me the most was the fact that the Iranians could close Hormuz to everyone else but keep it open to themselves. In almost every scenario that I saw in the past, the idea that the straits being closed would mean they were closed to everybody. And I think that this was something of a surprise that the Iranians could kind of fine tune the closure of the strait. I agree with Hamad that if they can continue to do that and do so with some kind of tacit acceptance from major consumers, not China particularly, it seems to me that that's an enormous longer term change, but in the short term was a real surprise to me. I also think that in terms of short term, that could have a long term effect. I mean, the fact that the United States entered this war with little to no consultation with the Gulf states, and for no immediate strategic reason, in contrast to, say, September 2019, when Iran attacked Saudi oil facilities, and the first Trump administration did nothing in response. Here, the second Trump administration initiates a major war with Iran at a time when Iran's position vis-a-vis what the United States always said was its primary interest in this region, which is the free flow of energy. Iran was not immediately or even in the intermediate term threatening that. I think that raises some questions among leadership and publics in the Gulf states of, just what is America about? I think that there have been times in the past when people in the Gulf have asked that same question, but this is the most severe incident where American actions have redounded to the direct harm of the Gulf states. Now, I don't think in the short term that any of these states has a good option other than sustaining their overall relationship, defense, security, economic, financial, et cetera, with the United States. But it has to get people thinking, how is this worth it? Because there's no alternative. It is. But I think that this is going to be this is going to place long-term questions in the minds of people in the Gulf states about just what their relationship with the United States can be and how do they find alternatives for that. I think Kristen was absolutely right about the long-term effects on the vision projects. Capital is a coward. Foreigners don't invest in places that are war zones. Tourists don't visit places that might be bombed. And as long as the Iranian regime sustains itself as this kind of player in the region, it's going to be hard for those vision projects to go forward. Again, that doesn't mean the end of Dubai, but it's harder to get the kind of foreign investment you need for those kinds of transformations. I think Hamad was absolutely right on defense tech and on perhaps new pipelines to safer ports. That helps. That can be an oil solution. It's not an LNG solution, obviously, which can't use pipelines to the same extent. But I think that we'll be talking about the consequences of this war for some time to come.
Okay, I will come back to the U.S. relationship with the Gulf in a minute, but I will just focus on. So it seems from the answers that economic integration seems to be, or more economic collaboration between GCC countries is something that that might potentially be an outcome of this war, but that means more reliance on Saudi Arabia, and to lesser extent Oman, because these are the only two GCC countries that have access to global economy from from places other than the Strait of Hormuz. How to square this with what we just discussed about that pre-war tension, rivalries, UAE exiting OPEC, Oman, we don't know, we are not sure if they are attended the GCC today or not. So how would we...
Sultan, yeah, it's going to be selective. And this is, I think, Hamad's earlier point. The Omanis, they don't need pipelines through Saudi Arabia. They've got ports. The UAE actually has, an area in Fujairah that they can export without the strait. Qatar is an LNG exporter. It's going to have to rely on at least given the current technological limitations, it's going to have to rely on Hormuz because it's got to ship this stuff out. It can't put it through pipelines. This might mean that the Kuwaitis become more integrated with Saudi Arabia. Bahrainis aren't a major oil producer, as we know. So it does seem to me that if it leads to more intra-Gulf economic collaboration, it's not going to be all six.
Okay. So it boils down basically to Kuwait and Qatar and Bahrain for other commodities that come through the Strait of Hormuz. So it will get it from other places. What do you think, Hamad?
Well, I absolutely agree with what Greg said. When you look at the economic integration between the Gulf states, it's not only solely between these six Gulf countries. I think they look at themselves as integrating economies and trade from between East and West. So we could see projects, for example, an oil pipeline that could go from Kuwait passing Saudi Arabia to Oman with a Chinese investment, for example. That's a possibility now. Still, it's a suggestion that's being floated around. We could also have an agreement that, could look into possibilities of increasing the supply routes between the Gulf states. Even if you look at going back to the Iranian threat of establishing a toll system, charging $2 million that for around, I think, 100 ships that transports each day, that's an equivalent of $88 billion a year. In comparison, an oil pipeline could cost 25 to 40% of that amount. It will take a couple of years, yes. But it could also strengthen the GCC integration through different economic hubs, supply routes that will provide jobs to Gulf citizens. And that actually will be a win-win situation for everyone here in the Gulf. So it could be collective, it could be bilateral, it could be multilateral in terms of 3 or 4 states, not necessarily all 6. But this is a possibility that could happen. Another thing to consider, Sultan, when we look at what's happening between UAE and Saudi Arabia, it's not an ideological differences between the 2 states. It's an interest-based disagreement. And this interest-based could always be resolved when you can reconciliate the 2 different interests of these 2 states and trying to translate it. So, and even UAE withdrawal, it's effective May 1st, not today. I'm not sure when is the next OPEC meeting. So it's also a possibility that the UAE could retract this withdrawal from OPEC Plus. That's always on the table. So we'll have to wait to take a wait-and-see approach on this.
So, Kristen, before I go to the U.S. Gulf relationship, I want to ask you about how do you see this war impacting GCC countries in terms of cultural aspects? So, I think yesterday or 2 days ago there was a a conference for GCC influencer, Gulf influencers, media influencers. I think it hosted in the UAE that generated some discussion and debates in about that. So, do you see a more of a disintegration or more of an integrated message that the Gulf countries are in regard with the war?
On the cultural side, if I understand your question, I mean, it's interesting because that's been kind of a leading edge of the new global integration strategy of all of the Gulf states, most notably in Saudi Arabia, I think just because the orientation of their global integration was different prior to the current leadership. So, I mean, that's been sort of a leading edge of the Gulf states trying to play this sort of hub strategy and to show that they're key players in all of these areas. And that includes sports too. It's arts, but also sports. I mean, they're also trying to be, key hubs for sporting events. I'm not sure this is what you're asking, but these are all things that are, again, under threat to the degree that they can't communicate security, like real security, because obviously those kinds of events can happen. And we've seen a lot of the Gulf states postponing or delaying a lot of those sorts of events. But I think they're gonna, obviously the goal is to try to hold on to the idea of normalcy. And I know UAE has been leaning very heavy and hard into that. And I can see why, because that's the plan that they have, right? Is to do that. And it's been pretty successful and really putting these countries on the map in those ways. So again, I'm sorry to give you not a very good answer, but it sort of depends how things end, right? So I think they're not going to want to release. They're not going to want to give up.
This is actually a good answer, but also I think I mixed two questions in my question into one. The other aspect of it is it's in terms of media strategy. So we've seen, for example, in Qatar. So in for example, in Al Jazeera, they are hosting. They hold this kind of CNN like debates with experts from the region, where there is an Iranian expert who became very famous in the Arab world because of the Al Jazeera platform. Whereas in other countries, we've seen different kind of strategies in how to deal with the war, how to frame it, how to discuss it in public, etc.
Yeah, well, that I would say is that media is always a leading edge of nationalism, and countries in this era have been really keen to get control over their media environments. I would argue that the Gulf crisis with Qatar was very much about that, actually, about wanting to limit Qatar's reach internally inside of the Saudi media sphere. I think we can see that happening again here, right? Where each of the countries are not fully aligned in the messaging that they want to do on this, again, key security issue. So yeah, it's interesting. I guess media is like another indicator of right now that the failure to sort of link all of their policies. And to that degree, I wouldn't say it's ideological. Like Hamid said, their differences aren't ideological, but they are kind of beyond just strict business interests. I mean, they extend to real strategic pictures that these states have created that does inform their broader alliance or alignment strategies. And those have a real narrative to them that matters, right? So it's not just small limited interests, it's interest that's built on these deeper ties with different states, and media is the key way of communicating those narratives. So to the degree we're seeing their narratives distinct, that's another kind of way to look at how they're dealing with this crisis.
Well,
Thank you, Chris.
Before we leave the long term, short term, it strikes me that so much of the long term impact on the Gulf states is going to depend on the long term impact on Iran. Right, where Iran goes as a result of this. We know in the short term, it's this war has kind of consolidated the power of the IRGC. It has pushed Iran into a much more aggressive military stance than we've seen from them in the past. We know that's the short-term take, but what's the long-term take for Iran? And obviously that's not something that I claim any expertise on, but Iran can go in all sorts of ways. And I think that how the Gulf views Iran and how their relations with Iran in the short term, I think Hamad is absolutely right that for most Gulf states, Iran is a much bigger threat and perhaps even an enemy now in a way that it hadn't been before. But if this war 2 years out actually weakens this regime and increases the pressure within Iran and leads to some kind of different regime, whether a real regime change or some kind of soft regime change in response to popular discontent, I think the Gulf states would very quickly reach out to a new Iran to try to consolidate a more, some kind of understanding about security issues in the Gulf. So a lot of this is going to depend on the longer term impact of this war on Iran.
I think this is great. I also think it depends on their relationship with the United States and how they view the United States, which takes me to the last point of this discussion before opening up to the Q&A. We received a few questions, and I want to leave room at the end of the session to ask these questions. So, as Hamad said, that this is a war that all, or at least most of Gulf countries were against it. They were not consulted. And now when the negotiations happen, they are not part of the negotiations. So what does that mean for GCC-US relationship? What does that mean for the US rule in the region? As Greg said, that we've been taught and teaching students that the one main interest of the United States in the region is to protect the free flow of energy, and this war is caused the largest and unprecedented closure of flow of oil region caused by U.S. action. So how do we see that going forward? What lessons that GCC countries will learn from their dependence on relationship with the United States, and what does that mean for the future? I'll start with you, Hamad.
For someone who studied different exogenous shocks to U.S. Gulf relations, I must say that these relations are pretty strong. They survived many events, many presidencies, many decades. But crises reveal the true nature of partnerships far more clearly than periods of calm. And the Gulf states are taking note of three things: that the U.S. initiated this war with no regard to their security and economic interest. The Gulf states, which are highly populated areas, were treated as operational war zones by the U.S. military. They view that not enough assets were deployed to protect against Iranian retaliation. So, Sultan, in diplomacy, the appearance of being taken for granted is often more corrosive than an actual disagreement, and credibility, once questioned, is not easily restored. But the Gulf states at the same time understand that Iran's goal is to weaken the U.S. Gulf relations, and they will not allow Iran to succeed, at least in this phase. But looking ahead, I see three likely consequences for these relations. First, a more transactional, consultative partnership. The Gulf states will insist on greater prior consultation before any major American or even Israeli actions that affect their territory. In return, they might expect more explicit security guarantees, perhaps moving beyond informal understanding towards something closer to formal defense commitments. Secondly, accelerated hedging by the Gulf. We have already seen deeper economic ties with China and renewed interest in Asian and European arms suppliers. So basically, this is the classic behavior of states that feel that their survival depends on diversified insurance. A caveat here is every ballistic missile and drone Iranian ballistic missile and drone that hit the Gulf state had a Chinese fingerprint, from BeeDo chips, a drone airframe, to petrochemicals used in the ballistic missiles. China maintains that these components are dual use, but now we know how the Iranians use these components, Chinese imported components. So this is an issue that the Gulf will have to approach China on and seek an understanding over it. Third, I think there is a window for a new regional equilibrium with Iran's conventional capabilities degraded and its nuclear ambition setback. So the US has an opportunity to help shape a regional order in which the Gulf states play a larger role in their own defense, supported by the US.
Thank you, Hamad. Greg.
So the Gulf states have been caught in a vise for decades vis-a-vis the United States. And we can go to international relations theory to understand this. One of the few occasions where international relations theory might actually help us understand a real world problem. And I think of this the structural condition of a weaker power in alliance with a stronger power, which Glenn Snyder talked about in his works in the 80s, as caught between entrapment and abandonment. The weaker party in that alliance fears being entrapped in wars that the larger party initiates without consultation. We see the perfect example in front of us right now. The weaker party also, though, fears abandonment by the stronger ally, and we know that that was one of the persistent themes of Gulf reactions to American policy over the previous 10 years, from Obama through Trump 1 through Biden, right? I think that the fears of abandonment were somewhat exaggerated, but I think that the fears of entrapment will now be seen as more serious than they were before. Now, in the short term, as Hamad said, there is no alternative for the Gulf states for their American tie. The short-term success of many of the air defense measures, although never complete, never 100%, is a testament to how American technology has helped the short-term defense and resilience. Getting air defense and other weapon systems from Asia, from Europe, doesn't replace the U.S. It just provides resilience, right? And so, in the short term, the web of relations, not just security, but financial, economic, all of them, right? Educational, cultural, human, populations. It means that these countries aren't going to run away from the U.S. But how they see their relationship with the U.S. develop, right? If they ask for formal defense treaties, would the U.S. be willing to give those? Right? The U.S. Many administrations have given executive agreements that don't have to go through Congress. But if you talk about a treaty, it has to go through Congress, and that's a real test of American intentions. It'd be interesting to see if the Gulf states push that way. I also think that the idea that Iranian conventional and nuclear military power for the medium term has been reduced is an interesting one, but I think that what this war has demonstrated is the Iranians don't need nuclear weapons or an enormous conventional military establishment to hold the world hostage. They can close the strait very easily. I don't think anybody fears the Iranian army marching across borders and taking them over. I don't think anybody fears that the Iranians are going to launch amphibious warfare and land troops on the beaches of the Gulf states. I think that what Iran can do is, with pretty cheap missiles and drones, do enormous damage, both in terms of the the energy and civilian infrastructures of the Gulf states and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And thus the reliance on great powers, I think, is going to be absolutely necessary for the Gulf states. And now how that works, is it a more exclusive American? I don't know. I think that's the rethink here. But one of the things that I've been thinking about during this crisis is that when you think of other global choke points like the Suez Canal or historically the Turkish Straits, now these were places that were within the sovereign territory of one country, but they are governed by international convention, right? Use of the Suez Canal, use of the Turkish Straits. There are international conventions that dictate how those waterways can be used, including by the sovereign power within which they reside. It seems to me that if I were the Gulf states or if I were in charge in the United States, neither of which is true, I would be pushing to bring in international actors in some kind of international agreement on the management of the Strait of Hormuz. And obviously the riparian countries are going to have a seat at that table, but so are the major consumer countries of energy. And that would be one way to constrain, at least somewhat, Iran's newfound ability to very cheaply close off the Strait of Hormuz. So I'm all for a new treaty relationship, a new international convention governing the management of the Strait of Hormuz, in which the Chinese are going to have to play a role, and the EU plays a role, and the Indians are going to play a role. I think that all of those things, all of those players have to be brought in to have a more secure system for the transit of energy.
Thank you, Greg. Kristen.
I think, especially to Greg's last point, I mean, for me, looking at this, the problem is not just simply about, how the Gulf states deal with, power shifts and how they deal with the two powers, like the US and China. It's that the US, which was previously, we can say, the hegemonic power in the region, the US itself is changing. It's not just the power shifts are changing, the US is changing. The nature of the US is changing. And through that, the role that the US is playing in the world is changing. And when the US, as the dominant power that set the global system, which we did, changes, the entire global system is at risk. And that's what we're seeing. And that's why, when you say when Hamid says, but we can't have, of course, we can't allow Iran to have control over the Strait of Hormuz. And then Greg counters, well, maybe we can come up with a new compact of how you can control the Strait of Hormuz. That's because we can't rely on the international law or what all the international norms were before. And as soon as Iran says this, then, I heard that there was some statement from, I can't remember what country it was, some country near Singapore saying, oh yeah, and we have the Malacca Straits too. We should be looking at our control over this. All of these things are under contention right now. And the same holds for free trade. The US is supposed to be championing free trade. We've been throwing tariffs out the wazoo on all of these different countries. We've been basically dismantling the free trade arena, on which, by the way, the Gulf states like the UAE constructed their entire global network hub strategy. So we're not undermining just our security partnership. We're undermining the entire system on which all of these countries built their understanding of what they were working into. So I think that's what makes it so hard for us as analysts to figure out where this is all going, because the very ground is shifting under our feet. And you can see the states are creating new pathways for this. That's why they're all coming up with new, this whole obsession with connectivity corridors and all this is. What is that? It's a replacement for a free market. You can't rely on that anymore. You need to have reliable partners that you make your deals with, and these bilateral and multilateral things that can start to do these things. There's all of these sorts of new fixes that are coming about. But I think that it all goes back to the US itself and the whole nature of the US as a country, what it stands for, what it's championing in the world is shifted.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question about the role of Iraq in the war and Hormuz, but I want to keep that at the last, and I will start with taking questions from the audience. So these questions were not directly to specific panelists. So each one of you who wants to answer the question, just answer it, and then we go to the second question. So the first question says, how are the Gulf countries balancing their relationship with the United States, China, and other global powers in this moment? And are they becoming more independent in terms of their foreign policy? I think we touched upon that, but if anyone who wants to add something to it.
More independent of each other.
Hamad?
Sorry, Sultan, I didn't hear the question.
So the question is whether they will be more independent or more or balancing their relationship with the United States, China, and other global powers in this moment, or are they becoming more independent in terms of their foreign policy?
I don't think this is mutually exclusive. They can be independent, but at the same time balance the relations between China and the US. But it's important to keep in mind that the US security partnership is not easily substituted, as Greg was saying, overnight. This is a process that will take 10 to 20, maybe even more years to look at and see how it evolves. The relationship with China is economical. We have oil, they need oil. We have huge infrastructure projects, and the Chinese are very quick, efficient, and cost effective in conducting these projects. But I think what we have seen is that the Gulf states now are willing to reach out to our Asian and European arms suppliers more than before. So that's an interesting take on how they are viewing and balancing the relationship with the US. Also, it will be interesting to see how things develop in the oil market. High oil prices historically has not been good for presidents or even half elections for the incumbent party. So how the Gulf states might contribute to this factor might actually have an impact on the relations with the administration.
Okay. So the second question is, could this conflict push the Gulf toward a new regional security dialogue that includes Iran? And I want to add to this question that one of the things that I was surprised by that, except I think for UAE, none of the Gulf countries that has established relationship with Iran, they closed their embassy or kicked off their. Does that mean that they are keeping the lines open and that they are open for engaging Iran post-war, despite what happened during the war?
I think they are. I mean, I think it's pretty clear they are. And I think for a good reason, because they really don't know how they're going to come out of this. And these are very, very fundamental interests that they have. I mean, when we're talking about control over the Strait of Hormuz, it's one thing to say that we absolutely can't accept this and we need to force a shift in this, which is, I understand completely why the Gulf states would say that now, because they can accept it. And they need right now to be toughening all of whoever's negotiating on their behalf, because they're not able to do it, to make this a priority and to really get that to the top and hope that it comes out in a way that's good for them. But they don't have the control to make that the case. So in that scenario, I think they have to at least be open, and maybe we should look at it as like short-term, long-term in this era of speaking at least to Iran. And we know that there's been some back channel through Oman already, just to help open airports and things like that, just so that they can survive in this period. So I think at least on that kind of practical level, they're going to have to be looking that way. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me either. I mean, I always thought the idea of cutting off relations with other countries was more a domestic political gesture. I mean, it just seems to me that you want to maintain the ability to talk to other folks. I think we have some evidence that that the Saudis were in touch directly with the Iranians at the beginning of the war. I think that the Crown Prince actually called the president. I think the Saudis, if I recall correctly, the Saudis publicly acknowledged that. So I'm not surprised that they're keeping avenues open, but I don't think that detracts from Hamid's point from the beginning of our session that all of the Gulf states, I think, are going to view the Iranian threat as a much more immediate reality than they might have in the past. It is ironic that most of the Gulf states continue to have Iranian ambassadors in them, and the Lebanese are trying to throw out the Iranian ambassador, but of course they can't make them leave.
So the next question is, Hamad, do you want to say something?
So, can I add just one point to this? Not I agree with what Kristen and Greg said. Add to this another point that no matter what credible deterrence move that the Gulf state takes, it's also important to be coupled with a proactive diplomatic approach toward Iran. Before the war, these fragile diplomatic bridges that they tried to have with Iran, marked by the 2023 Beijing detente, basically collapsed during this war. Not entirely, because as Greg was mentioning, we saw the communication not only between the Crown Prince and the Iranian president, but also between the two foreign ministers. And the fact that the Iranian ambassador in each of these Gulf states is present, he can pick up the phone, he can go to meetings in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the respected states, also shows a sign that they want to keep this dialogue open. A regional dialogue, yes, but to what ends and to what means? I think it will involve the interests of the Gulf states. It will involve the interest that will not be spoken about it in, they did not speak about in Islamabad talks. This is the regional negotiation table that will be on matters relating to the both neighbors over this Gulf.
So the next question.
One small thing though,
Yeah.
Sultan, I think the question asked specifically if they would join like the Iranian
Yeah.
pact. So that's kind of like on Iran's terms. I haven't seen any indication except
Yeah.
perhaps Oman. I'm a little bit unclear where Oman is these days, to be honest, but maybe Oman, but the others aren't. And I think when you see, again, like I said before, these other regional strategies taking place where the UAE is still leading quite a bit on Israel, and the US more, and Saudi Arabia is leading more and bringing in other partners like Pakistan, like Turkey, some of the other states with Turkey. That's the way to counterbalance and add deterrence, like they said, against Iran. So that doesn't indicate to me that they're just going to completely join the Iranian new vision for the Gulf region.
Yeah. Thank you. So my next question is that until this war, Iran attacking the Gulf states was a hypothetical. Now that the unthinkable has come to pass, these Arab nations have an imperative to not allow this to become normalized. The future of this new dynamic is directly related to geographic proximity and Iran's missile and drone capabilities. How does a negotiated end to the war ensure the security of KSA and the other Arab Gulf states?
There's no guarantees in international politics. It seems to me that the way this war ends, if it ends with Iran able to charge, in effect, tolls for shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, then Iran has a whip hand over the economies of all of the Gulf countries to a greater or lesser extent. And that drives the Gulf countries into the alternative, if at all possible, the alternative ways of marketing their energy that we discussed earlier. If the war ends with the Iranians backed off that, with their conventional and nuclear, their conventional capabilities degraded and their nuclear infrastructure set back, but a continued hostility evidenced by an Iranian regime that if you if you accept the old distinction between hardliners and moderates, it's more hardline than it was before. Then the Gulf states have to think more in terms of deterrence than cooperation. But if you, after a couple of years, you see some kind of soft change, or even a regime change in Iran from within, not imposed from the outside, then it seems to me that you open up the possibilities of a more productive diplomatic interchange that might lead to a common understanding of the management of these big issues, like how does the Strait of Hormuz work? A lot depends on how Iran comes out of this.
I have a follow-up question on this, but does anyone else want to add anything to this? So, Greg, so let's assume that they have control over Hormuz. The war ended with them having the charge tolls over the Bath of Hormuz. Does that means that the main rationale for the U.S. military framework in the Gulf has lost its justification? Because
it's a big chunk of its justification, that's for sure. I mean, to the extent that part of the American military presence was deterrent, it loses that to some extent. To the extent that the American military presence was to safeguard the free flow of energy, it loses that to some extent. And so the American military presence kind of devolves into how helpful can we be to the Gulf states in terms of their own air defense and other defense mechanisms. But yeah, I mean, if Iran, sets up the metaphorical toll booth, you do have to wonder what all these American bases are doing there.
So my last question here is, what does this war mean for the Abrahamic Accords and UAE-led effort to normalize relations with Israel without the resolution to the Palestinian situation? Will the Gulf accept Israeli hegemony and embrace Iranian enmity as the new normal?
No. The answer is no. So I don't think that the Gulf states, I think even the countries, UAE and Bahrain, who signed the Abraham Accords with Israel, are currently asking, what did we actually get from this relations? Did they get any preferential treatment in the US? Did they get the F-35? Did they get special access to technological assets that they were trying to acquire? Did we get the most hit by Iran because of this relationship? I think they are reevaluating the relationship right now and the Abraham Accords. As it comes to other Gulf states, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, the Abraham Accords is basically a solution without a solution. Normalizing relationship without fixing the core issue of the Palestinian cause and not committing to a two-state solution. If there's a movement from a future Israeli government, because I don't think the Netanyahu government is capable of making reaching such an agreement, then yes, we could reach a solution on the basis of the Arab League initiative or some sort of a joint Palestinian-Israeli, then they will continue. I think the point that Kristen mentioned is extremely important on seeing how the Saudis try to play in this crisis by grouping Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan, or what they call the Step Alliance, trying to. So I'm not sure what will come out of this alliance, to be honest. But at least aesthetically, it's there. So it's an important point to keep in mind. I actually wanted to comment on your previous question. How to deal with Iran. If the UAE is the largest trading partner with Iran, or as an UAE official once positioned it, Iran's economic lung was hit also the most. So what does the relationship should look like? I think the relationship will ultimately be centered on a credible deterrence, but also an extending in a hand where both options will have consequences for the Iranians and how to deal with them. I'll stop here. Thank you, Sultan.
I'll just put out that I disagree with Hamid, at least based on what the Emiratis are saying. I mean, they're making a ledger right now of who are the good countries and the bad countries in this war, who supported them, who didn't, and the Israelis are on the positive ledger. Very publicly, they're saying that they got support from Israel, and they've also been saying that they see the future of the region, all of the states coming around and getting closer to the United States and to Israel. That's where they think the outcome will be at the long end of this. So I don't know, if that's where things will actually go or not, but I think that's at least the messaging that the Emiratis are putting out publicly right now.
There were news as well yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago, that they got Iron Dome capabilities from Israel.
They are getting
right, and
benefits from this. So.
And other Gulf states, I think the Saudis, to some extent, in the lead on this. Even before this war, we're seeing Israel as not a stabilizing force in the region, but a chaos agent, whether it's in Syria or Lebanon, much less in the territories in West Bank and Gaza and Palestine. And I think that the fact that the Israelis played such a central role in not only in the war itself, but in persuading the United States, or President Trump, I should say, to enter this war. I mean, that's also an element of chaos that Gulf states are suffering from. So I do think that Kristen is right, that you can come out of this war as a Gulf state with very different strategic notions. It doesn't extend to some kind of ideological difference, as Hamid pointed out earlier. But these are something beyond just simple interest. It comes down to kind of a grand strategic difference. Is Israel a potential ally, or is Israel a destabilizing factor in a region that we the Gulf states would like to see much more stable?
I want to challenge this notion that these differences are not ideological. So if we look at the Abrahamic Accords as a framework, there is, I think, Greg, you said this in the past, that each normalization agreement between Arab country with Israel, it's basically an agreement with the United States, or an extraction of benefits from the United States.
Correct.
But I think the UAE is the exception. Because they are not getting any. We thought that it's because of the F-35, but they didn't get this, and they are doubling down on this relationship, and it has something to do with challenging the norms of what an Arab country should be. So there is some norms for an Arab country. That Arab country should be acting in certain behavior and adopting certain positions and stuff like that. And for the UAE, they're trying to disrupt this and say why we are concerned about this. This is an economic viable partner in the region. We can do security and economic agreement with them, and and most of the drive is to challenge these kind of norms and ideological that taken for granted. I also add to that there are some kind overlap over anti-Islamism on that part, and that is an ideological part of it.
That's a very good point. I would continue to emphasize what Kristen said before, that the regime type, this rather limited regime type of ruling monarchs in a world where very, very few of them exist, will continue to be a baseline common interest. I can't imagine that anyone in the Emirates would think that if the Saudi monarchy collapsed, that they would be just fine. I can't imagine that they would think that. But your point that this goes beyond simple interest to pushing this taboo of relations with Israel, which was broken decades ago, but pushing it even further to kind of, who cares what happens in the West Bank and Gaza if our country have a productive relationship with Israel, that's enough. That's more than just a short-term interest. That is a kind of a grand strategic notion about how to deal with the world.
Although, to be fair, I don't think they say they don't care at all what happens in the West Bank and Gaza. Just to pull back a little bit.
What you say and what you do are two different things, right?
Definitely Jerusalem, at least they care what happens there. And they do kind of, I'm interested in watching this partnership between Bahrain and Jordan too with the UAE, because they seem, the three of them, to have kind of a special conversation going on.
So we have Hamad.
Sultan, one point I would like to inject in this discussion is that how do the Gulf states that established or normalized relation with Israel view this relationship, and to what ends? If you go back in '94, when Qatar started opening diplomatic or informal diplomatic channels with Israel, it was triggered by a security threat that it felt after a territorial dispute with Saudi Arabia. But that suddenly changed, and their relationship with Israel been on the back burner since other things developed in the Gulf. Now the relationship with UAE, as Kristen was saying, publicly they are saying, yes, but that could also change, as we've all know that publicly stated that the relationship between UAE and Saudi Arabia was as excellent just maybe a couple months before the public diplomatic spat that took place. So the good thing about it is not ideological. They see a value in this relationship, whether through directly with Israel or maybe as benefits they receive. At least they perceive that they will get it from the US. So I would argue that it's actually not ideological. It's interest-based, driven by their own concerns, whether security or economic.
Thank you, Hamad. So we have 2 minutes. I wanted to ask my question about Iraq. I think there is something to be monitored there. There is a development happening with Iraq and its relationship with the region, but I will be punctual, stick to the time. Thank you very much for this rich and insightful discussion. And thank you to our audience for joining us. We look forward to continue this conversation in the future. Thanks.